Imagine a city where, by 1937, nearly 25,000 Russian émigrés lived side by side, making them the largest foreign community in Shanghai. A city where former princes shared the same sidewalks as ex-sailors, where imperial officers waited in line beside the servants who had once worked in their households. A city where you could spend an entire day speaking Russian, attend a service in a Russian Orthodox church, send your children to a Russian school, watch a performance in a Russian theater, and still have no country to call your own. But behind that remarkable picture was a devastating truth. Only 15 years earlier, in 1922, thousands of these people still believed their exile would be temporary. They did not leave Russia as immigrants. They left believing they would return in a matter of months, perhaps a few years. Instead, they found themselves on the opposite side of Asia, in a city that had never intended to become the last refuge of a vanished empire. And then, steamships began entering the harbor of Shanghai, carrying wave after wave of exhausted refugees. Among them were those evacuated aboard the vessels of Admiral Georgy Stark's Siberian flotilla, following the final collapse of the White Movement in the Russian Far East in 1922. The decks were crowded with officers in worn uniforms, government officials clutching battered suitcases, mothers holding frightened children, and elderly parents staring silently toward the disappearing coastline. They had not merely lost a war. They had lost the country that had given meaning to their entire lives. There is a bitter irony here. These people had survived revolution, civil war, hunger, and a dangerous journey across the sea. Yet the greatest hardships still lay ahead, not on the battlefield, but in peace. After the Russian Revolution, countless émigrés in China became stateless persons. Their imperial Russian passports no longer protected them. The Soviet government was not their government. Legally, they belonged nowhere. Many would eventually carry Nansen passports, international identity documents created for refugees who no longer had a recognized homeland. Imagine holding a passport that quietly admits you no longer have a country. You can state your full name. You can recite your family's history. You can describe the house where you were born. But on paper, you no longer belong to any nation on earth. And that single fact changed everything. Without recognized citizenship, finding work became more difficult. Traveling required endless paperwork. Legal protection was uncertain. Every official document reminded these refugees that they existed in a strange space between nations, alive but politically invisible. Yet something extraordinary happened in Shanghai. Against every expectation, the Russian community began rebuilding fragments of the world they had lost. Orthodox churches opened their doors. Russian schools educated a new generation of children born far from home. Theaters staged performances in their native language. Charitable organizations and community societies appeared across the city, preserving traditions that had survived the collapse of an empire. From the outside, it almost looked as if a small piece of Imperial Russia had somehow escaped history. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind apartment doors, former generals quietly folded away their uniforms forever. Women raised in aristocratic households searched desperately for any work that would keep their families alive. Parents sold the last valuables they had carried from Russia, one possession after another, simply to buy food for another week. Every sunrise pushed them further from the homeland they still believed they might someday see again. What they could not yet understand was that the tragedy of Shanghai did not begin in China. It began thousands of miles away during the final days of the Russian Civil War, when one decision transformed what seemed like a temporary retreat into an exile that would last for the rest of their lives. The story did not begin in Shanghai. It began thousands of kilometers away, on the frozen edge of the Russian Far East, where the last hopes of the white movement were slowly slipping away. By 1922, the Russian Civil War had raged for years. Entire armies had disappeared. Cities had changed hands more than once. Every new defeat was explained away as temporary. Every retreat was described as strategic. The people who would eventually rebuild a Russian colony in Shanghai still believed history had one more turn left. They were wrong. In the autumn of 1922, the final white-controlled territories in the Russian Far East collapsed. As Bolshevik forces advanced, there was little doubt about the outcome. The question was no longer whether the white movement would survive. The only remaining question was how many people could escape before the last routes closed forever. And then, ships belonging to Admiral Georgy Stark's Siberian flotilla prepared for evacuation. The docks became scenes of controlled panic. Families arrived, carrying whatever they could transport with their own hands. A small suitcase, a family icon, a bundle of letters tied together with string, an officer's sword that would never again be worn in battle. People were forced to make impossible decisions in minutes. What do you save when your entire life no longer fits aboard a ship? No inventory exists for the things that were left behind forever. A piano that had stood in a family home for generations. Portraits of grandparents. Libraries collected over decades. Wedding dresses carefully preserved by mothers for daughters who would now grow up in exile. Most of those boarding the ships did not believe they were saying goodbye forever. They believed they were leaving until the war was over, until Russia returned to normal, until someone defeated the Bolsheviks. That hope would become one of the cruelest illusions of the 20th century. Among those fleeing were not only generals or noble families. According to historical research, the future Russian community in Shanghai included people from almost every layer of imperial society: aristocrats, military officers, civil servants, sailors, engineers, merchants, laborers, and railway employees. In Russia, their social status had separated them. In exile, those distinctions began to disappear almost overnight. There's another bitter irony here. Back home, a family name could open doors to universities, government offices, military careers, and high society. In Shanghai, that same name often meant nothing at all. No employer cared how many generations your family had served the czar. They wanted to know one thing: could you work tomorrow morning? The psychological collapse often came long before the financial one. For years, these refugees lived with the belief that their departure was temporary. They carefully stored uniforms instead of throwing them away. They packed official documents proving imperial service. Parents continued teaching their children Russian history exactly as if they expected to return home within months. But reality refused to cooperate. After the revolution, these refugees gradually became stateless persons. Their imperial passports lost legal value, while Soviet citizenship was unacceptable to many white émigrés. Eventually, countless Russians living in China relied on Nansen passports, international identity documents created specifically for people who no longer possessed recognized nationality. It solved one problem, but it created another. Every border crossing, every job application, every official procedure reminded them that they belonged nowhere. They had escaped death, yet they could not escape uncertainty. Shanghai itself offered opportunity, but never certainty. The city was one of Asia's busiest international ports. Ships from Europe, America, and across the Pacific arrived daily. Foreign concessions, Chinese districts, banks, factories, hotels, warehouses, and crowded streets created an illusion that anyone could begin again there. For Russian refugees, however, every opportunity came with a painful reminder. They were rebuilding lives on borrowed ground. Then, as the years passed, another disaster unfolded far to the north. Following the Japanese occupation of Manchuria in 1931, conditions for Russian émigrés living in places such as Harbin became increasingly difficult. A new wave of displaced Russians began moving toward Shanghai, believing the city offered greater safety and better prospects than Japanese-controlled Manchuria. They did not know they were bringing with them not only hope, but also the next chapter of a tragedy that would force former officers, noble women, railway workers, and government officials to reinvent themselves in ways they could never have imagined. The moment that changed everything did not happen with a single gunshot. It happened when people realized there was no road back. In the closing weeks of 1922, as Bolshevik control spread across the Russian Far East, the evacuation ordered through Admiral Georgy Stark's Siberian flotilla became more than a military withdrawal. It became the final chapter of an entire way of life. Officers who had spent years fighting the Civil War now stood on crowded piers, not giving orders for battle, but helping children and elderly parents board ships. There would be no triumphant return. There would be no final counteroffensive, only departure. And then, the gangways were lifted. Steam drifted across the harbor as the ships slowly pulled away from the docks. Families crowded the rails, watching the coastline disappear into the distance. Some remained silent. Others crossed themselves. Parents held frightened children close, trying to appear calm while knowing they could no longer promise where the family would live a month later. No official ceremony marked the end of the white movement. No orchestra played. No speeches were delivered for history books. Instead, history ended quietly, with the sound of ship engines and the sight of a homeland fading beyond the horizon. For countless passengers, the hardest part was not fear. It was uncertainty. They did not know where they would settle. They did not know whether foreign governments would accept them. They did not know how they would earn money, educate their children, or even prove who they were once their Russian documents lost legal recognition. Yet almost everyone carried the same belief. This is temporary. We will return. That belief shaped every decision they made. People packed family icons instead of furniture, military decorations instead of household goods, official certificates instead of practical tools. They preserved symbols of the lives they expected to reclaim rather than preparing for the completely different future that awaited them. Here lies one of history's cruelest ironies. The possessions they treasured most would soon become almost worthless. An officer's commission carried little weight in Shanghai. An aristocratic title could not buy bread. Years of government service meant nothing to employers looking for drivers, laborers, or security guards. The passengers simply did not know it yet. As the ships crossed the sea toward China, another invisible transformation had already begun. These refugees were no longer leaving Russia. Russia was leaving them. Every kilometer placed between the ships and the coast made political reality harder to deny. The state they had served no longer existed in the form they recognized. The institutions that had shaped their careers had collapsed. Their military victories and defeats suddenly mattered less than finding a place to sleep. By the time the ships approached Shanghai, they were no longer officers on campaign. They were refugees. Their arrival did not resemble the return of defeated soldiers. It resembled the arrival of people carrying an entire civilization inside a handful of suitcases. Some stepped onto the docks wearing carefully maintained military uniforms, believing appearance still reflected dignity. Others wore civilian clothing for the first time in years. Children looked around with curiosity. Their parents looked around with calculation, silently asking the same question: how long will we stay? The answer would prove far more devastating than anyone imagined. Weeks became months. Months became years. Years became decades. The temporary refuge slowly transformed into permanent exile. And before these families could even begin rebuilding their lives, they would discover that surviving war had been only the first battle. The next struggle would not be fought with rifles or artillery. It would be fought every morning in the search for work, in the humiliation of lost status, and in the painful realization that yesterday's elite would have to compete for tomorrow's wages in a city that owed them nothing. When the ships finally reached Shanghai, the journey was over. The exile was just beginning. For years, these men and women had measured their lives by military campaigns, government service, family estates, or professional careers inside the Russian Empire. Now, they measured them by something far simpler. Could they find a place to sleep before nightfall? Could they feed their children tomorrow? Could they survive one more week? And then, the city opened before them. Shanghai in the early 1920s was unlike anywhere they had ever seen. Chinese laborers pushed loaded carts through narrow streets. Rickshaws wove between automobiles. British policemen directed traffic in the international settlement. Merchant ships crowded the Huangpu River. The smell of coal smoke mixed with sea salt and street food. Dozens of languages echoed through the harbor. It was one of the busiest ports in Asia. But to the refugees stepping ashore, it felt impossibly foreign. The uniforms, customs, climate, language, even the rhythm of daily life were different from anything they had known in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Vladivostok, or the towns they had left behind. Yet they had no choice but to adapt. One of the first shocks came not from poverty, but from paperwork. Back in Russia, a passport had been proof of citizenship. In Shanghai, countless white émigrés slowly discovered that they no longer belonged to any recognized state. Their imperial documents had lost practical value. Soviet citizenship was unacceptable to many of them. In time, large numbers would depend on Nansen passports, documents created specifically for stateless refugees. Imagine standing before an official. You know exactly who you are. He's the one who is uncertain. Your identity has become a question that must be negotiated every time you cross a border, apply for work, or deal with the authorities. That uncertainty followed them everywhere. Finding employment was no longer simply a matter of qualifications. Employers often preferred applicants whose legal status was clear. Stateless refugees lived under constant bureaucratic pressure, never entirely certain what rights they possessed or how long they would be allowed to remain. Still, survival demanded action. The first generation of Russian émigrés quickly understood that memories could not pay rent. Former military officers accepted jobs that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. According to historical research, ex-officers and former government officials worked as drivers, security guards, laborers, clerks, and small shopkeepers, taking whatever employment they could secure to support their families. For some, the humiliation was overwhelming. A man who had once commanded soldiers now opened doors for wealthy foreign businessmen. Another who had signed official government papers now unloaded cargo in the docks. Titles disappeared. Rank disappeared. Only work remained. The same transformation unfolded inside thousands of Russian households. Women who had been raised in privileged families entered the workforce because there was no alternative. Historical studies show that Russian émigré women found employment as seamstresses, governesses, waitresses, singers, and performers. Some managed to rebuild stable lives through honest work. Others were not so fortunate. Academic research also records that a number of Russian women, driven by extreme poverty, were forced into prostitution simply to survive. The exact scale remains debated by historians, but the existence of this tragedy is well documented. There is perhaps no clearer symbol of the collapse of an empire than this. A society once defined by rank and privilege had become a community where survival outweighed status. Yet something remarkable happened despite the hardship. Instead of disappearing, the Russian community began rebuilding itself. Orthodox churches reopened. Russian schools welcomed children whose memories of their homeland were already beginning to fade. Theaters staged performances in their native language. Charitable organizations helped newly arrived refugees find shelter, food, and work. It was an extraordinary act of cultural resistance. If they could no longer save their country, they would try to save its memory. But history was not finished with them, because the next blow would not fall on one family or one profession or one generation. It would fall on an entire people whose greatest crime was belonging to the Russia that no longer existed. The Russian Empire had fallen. The Civil War was over. The guns had largely fallen silent. But for the people who had fled to Shanghai, punishment did not end with military defeat. It followed them across the sea. Unlike soldiers returning home after an ordinary war, white émigrés entered a world where the very identity they carried became a burden. They were no longer judged only by what they had done during the Civil War. They were judged by who they had been before it. An imperial officer, a government official, a member of the old elite. Sometimes that alone was enough to close doors. And then a different kind of sentence began, not one announced in a courtroom, not one read aloud by a judge. A sentence without an expiration date. Statelessness. After the revolution, tens of thousands of Russian refugees living in China found themselves without internationally recognized citizenship. Their imperial passports had effectively become relics. Accepting Soviet citizenship was, for many white émigrés, unthinkable. It would have meant recognizing the government they believed had destroyed everything they had fought to defend. So they became people without a country. The introduction of Nansen passports gave them a legal identity, but not a homeland. These documents allowed refugees to travel and, in many cases, seek employment more easily than before. Yet every passport also carried a painful message. You exist, but you belong nowhere. It is difficult today to imagine what that meant in everyday life. Every application for employment required explanations. Every request to travel raised questions. Every interaction with authorities reminded these refugees that they were permanent outsiders. Their children were growing up speaking Russian at home, hearing Chinese in the streets, and living under foreign administrations that considered them neither citizens nor permanent residents. They lived in limbo. For years. For decades. There is a profound irony here. The Russian Empire had once ruled over one of the largest territories on Earth. Now, some of its former servants could not legally claim even a single square meter as their own country. Yet instead of surrendering to despair, the émigrés began creating something remarkable. They rebuilt institutions that no longer existed anywhere else. Historical research shows that the Russian community established Orthodox churches, Russian language schools, theaters, charitable organizations, and numerous civic associations throughout Shanghai. These institutions became far more than places of worship or education. They became islands of memory. Children learned Russian history from teachers who still spoke of the empire as something more than a chapter in a textbook. Church bells reminded elderly refugees of villages they would never see again. Theaters preserved language, literature, and traditions that many feared would disappear forever. It was an act of quiet defiance. If history had erased their country, they would refuse to let it erase their identity. By 1934, contemporary legal studies estimated that roughly 20,000 Russians lived in Shanghai, while another 10,000 resided in Tianjin. Just 3 years later, Estimates place the Russian population of Shanghai at approximately 25,000, making it the city's largest foreign community. Those numbers tell an extraordinary story. This was no longer a handful of refugees. It was an entire society rebuilding itself in exile. But numbers can hide suffering. Behind every school stood families struggling to pay tuition. Behind every church stood worshipers who no longer knew where they would be buried. Behind every theater sat audiences who applauded performances in a language their grandchildren might one day forget. They had rebuilt a Russian world, but they had not escaped history. Because the greatest story of this exile was never about admirals or aristocrats. It belonged to ordinary people, to a former officer driving strangers through the streets of Shanghai, to a railway worker who had lost both his career and his country, to a seamstress stitching clothes late into the night, and to women forced to make impossible choices simply to keep their families alive. Their stories would reveal the true price of losing an empire. History usually remembers the names of generals. It remembers governments, treaties, and revolutions. It counts victories and defeats, but it rarely remembers the man who once commanded soldiers and later drove a taxi through the streets of Shanghai, or the woman who had grown up believing she would spend her life attending balls in St. Petersburg, only to discover that survival depended on how many dresses she could sew in a single week. This is where the real story begins. Not with empires, with people. And then, every morning, long before sunrise, former officers left small rented apartments and walked toward jobs that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. Historical research shows that numerous ex-officers and former imperial officials found work as drivers, guards, laborers, clerks, and small shopkeepers. The uniforms they had once worn with pride were carefully folded away in trunks. Some never wore them again. Imagine the silence inside one of those apartments. A military decoration lies inside a wooden box. Beside it rests an old photograph taken before the revolution. Outside, the former officer starts an automobile, not as a commander, but as a chauffeur transporting businessmen who know nothing about the battles he survived. He still stands straight. He still speaks with discipline. But now his rank earns him nothing. His wages depend entirely on how many passengers he can serve before nightfall. There is a painful irony in that transformation. The skills that had once defined his identity, leadership, military experience, loyalty to the empire, had almost no value in exile. Survival demanded completely different abilities. Inside another apartment across the city, the story unfolded differently. A woman who had been raised in comfort sat before a sewing machine. According to historical research, large numbers of Russian émigré women earned a living as seamstresses, governesses, waitresses, singers, and performers. Every finished dress meant another day of food for the family. Every repaired coat helped pay the rent. The sewing machine became as important as bread. Its rhythm filled rooms that had once echoed with piano music. She may have remembered elegant salons back in Russia. Now, she measured time by pieces of fabric and exhausted hands. Her children watched without fully understanding how much had changed. To them, this was simply life. For their mother, it was the collapse of an entire world. Not every story found even that fragile stability. Academic studies also document that some Russian women, trapped by extreme poverty and the absence of family support, were forced into prostitution. Historians continue to debate the scale of this tragedy, but they agree that it existed. Think about what that meant. These were not anonymous figures in a statistic. Some had been daughters of officers. Some had studied music. Some had dreamed of becoming teachers or doctors. Instead, exile pushed them toward choices no one should ever have to make. The empire had fallen. Its consequences continued to destroy lives long after the fighting had ended. Another group carried a different burden. Among those who reached Shanghai were former employees of the Chinese Eastern Railway. Before exile, they had possessed valuable technical skills and stable employment along one of the Russian Empire's most important rail networks in Manchuria. Political upheaval and the aftermath of the Civil War shattered that security. They did not lose only their jobs. They lost the world in which those jobs had meaning. Some searched for work wherever they could find it. Others accepted positions far below their qualifications simply because their families could not wait. Yet despite everything, something extraordinary happened. The community refused to disappear. After long shifts driving taxis, unloading cargo, sewing clothes, or working behind shop counters, Russian émigrés still gathered in Orthodox churches. Parents insisted their children learn Russian. Teachers continued lessons inside Russian language schools. Actors performed in theaters before audiences that desperately wanted to believe culture could survive even when a country could not. It was an act of quiet resistance against oblivion. But history was preparing another blow. In 1931, events far beyond Shanghai would once again change the fate of these refugees. The world they had painstakingly rebuilt was about to be shaken by a new conflict, one that would prove exile has no final destination, only new frontiers of uncertainty. By the early 1930s, many Russian émigrés believed they had finally achieved something resembling stability. Not prosperity, not happiness, but stability. Children attended Russian schools in the morning. Churches filled with familiar prayers every Sunday. Small businesses served the growing Russian community. Former officers had become drivers, mechanics, guards, or clerks. Former noblewomen earned a living with sewing needles instead of family fortunes. Life was difficult, but it was predictable. Then, in 1931, history arrived at their doorstep once again. And then, Japan occupied Manchuria. The political map of Northeast Asia changed almost overnight. For thousands of Russians who had settled in Harbin and other cities connected to the Chinese Eastern Railway, the occupation created a new wave of uncertainty. Conditions became increasingly difficult, and historical research shows that another stream of Russian refugees began moving toward Shanghai, believing the international city offered greater safety and better opportunities. They had already escaped one revolution. Now they were fleeing another geopolitical crisis. There is a cruel pattern throughout the history of exile. Just when refugees begin rebuilding their lives, history forces them to start over again. By the mid-1930s, Shanghai's Russian population continued to grow. Contemporary legal studies estimated approximately 20,000 Russians lived in the city by 1934, while later estimates for 1937 placed the number at around 25,000. From the outside, it appeared to be a remarkable success. The largest foreign community in Shanghai, Russian churches, Russian newspapers, Russian schools, Russian theaters. But beneath that appearance lay constant insecurity. These people still remained stateless. A passport could identify them. It could not protect them. Every political crisis raised the same terrifying question. What happens if the country sheltering us can no longer protect us? Unlike citizens, stateless refugees possessed no government capable of defending their interests. If regulations changed, if authorities imposed new restrictions, or if conflict spread, they had very few places to turn. They had escaped Russia. They had not escaped vulnerability. For older émigrés, the emotional burden grew heavier every year. Children who had arrived in Shanghai as infants were becoming adults. Some spoke Russian with accents shaped by life in China. Some remembered almost nothing of the homeland their parents described with such longing. Family conversations began to change. Parents spoke about return. Children spoke about the future. Those two dreams no longer pointed toward the same destination. That quiet divide may have been one of exile's greatest tragedies. The first generation lived in memory. The second generation had to live in reality. And reality became even harsher during the years that followed. War spread across China. Political uncertainty became part of everyday life. Businesses struggled. Employment became less secure. Every rumor carried the possibility of another evacuation, another departure, another beginning. Imagine surviving the Russian Revolution, then surviving the Civil War, then rebuilding your life from nothing, only to realize that history was preparing to uproot you once again. Some families packed suitcases they had never fully unpacked. Others refused to unpack at all. They had learned a painful lesson. Home could disappear overnight. By the end of the Second World War, the future of Shanghai itself had become uncertain. And when political power in China changed in the years that followed, the Russian community faced a decision that seemed impossible. Stay once more under a new regime, or leave everything behind. Again, the next journey would not lead back to Russia. It would scatter the last great Russian colony across the United States, Australia, South America, and other parts of the world, bringing an extraordinary chapter of exile to its final, heartbreaking conclusion. When people speak about the fall of an empire, they usually imagine the final battle. A palace in flames, a government collapsing, a flag lowered for the last time. But empires rarely die in a single moment. Their collapse echoes across generations. And for the Russians of Shanghai, that echo lasted far longer than anyone had imagined in 1922. At first glance, their stories seemed to be about one refugee community living in one foreign city. In reality, it was about something much larger. It was about what happens when an entire social order disappears. And then, the people who had once belonged to one of the world's largest empires found themselves scattered across continents. The Russian community in Shanghai became an extraordinary meeting place for people who, under normal circumstances, might never have shared the same neighborhood. Former aristocrats lived alongside railway workers. Imperial officers stood beside mechanics. Government officials attended church with dock workers and sailors. The revolution had erased distinctions that had once seemed permanent, not through equality, through loss. There's another bitter irony here. Before 1917, status had determined nearly every aspect of life in Imperial Russia: education, military careers, marriage prospects, social circles, even where a family lived. In exile, hunger ignored titles. Rent ignored family names. Employment ignored noble ancestry. The only hierarchy that mattered was whether someone could earn enough money to survive another month. Yet despite losing almost everything, the émigrés preserved something that proved remarkably resilient: memory. Inside Russian Orthodox churches, prayers continued exactly as they had before the revolution. Teachers in Russian schools instructed children in a language that was becoming increasingly distant from the streets outside their classroom windows. Actors stepped onto theater stages, performing works from a homeland that many audience members would never see again. These institutions did more than preserve culture. They preserved identity. For parents, every lesson taught in Russian was an act of resistance. Every church service was a declaration that their history had not ended in 1917 or 1922. Every theatrical performance insisted that exile did not erase civilization, but time was working against them. Children born or raised in Shanghai knew another reality. Their memories were not filled with snow-covered Russian villages or the broad avenues of St. Petersburg. Their memories belonged to Shanghai, to crowded markets, to the Huangpu River, to streets where Chinese, English, French, and Russian blended into a single soundtrack. The first generation remembered what had been lost. The second generation learned to live with what remained. That difference quietly reshaped the future of the community. As decades passed, the dream of returning to Russia slowly transformed into something less tangible. Not a plan, a memory. Then history intervened once more. The end of the Second World War changed Asia as dramatically as the Russian Revolution had changed Eastern Europe. Political power shifted across China. The future that Russian émigrés had spent decades constructing suddenly became uncertain again. The city that had sheltered them for years could no longer promise permanence. Families faced impossible decisions: remain where they had rebuilt their lives, or begin yet another migration. For countless people, the answer was painfully familiar: leave. Once again, historical research shows that after the Second World War and the communist victory in China, the majority of Shanghai's Russian community immigrated to the United States, Australia, South America, and other countries, bringing an end to what had once been the largest Russian colony in the city. Think about the scale of that journey. One generation had left Russia. The next left China. Some families crossed half the globe twice within a single lifetime. Each migration carried fewer possessions than the last. But one thing always traveled with them: the memory of a country that existed more vividly in stories than on maps. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the Russians of Shanghai. They prove that an empire can disappear, a government can fall, a passport can lose all legal value. But memory has a remarkable ability to survive long after borders have changed. The final chapter of this story, however, belongs not to those who fled, but to the children and grandchildren who inherited an identity shaped by a homeland they had never truly known. For the first generation of Russian émigrés, the dream never truly died. Even after 10 years, even after 20, some still believe they would one day return to Russia. They kept family icons wrapped in cloth. They preserved imperial military medals inside wooden boxes. They spoke of St. Petersburg and Moscow not as places from the past, but as places waiting in the future. But history had already made its decision. And then, another revolution changed everything. After the Second World War, China entered a new political era. As communist forces gained control of the country, Shanghai, the city that had become the greatest refuge of white Russian exile, could no longer offer the security it once had. The question every family had avoided for decades suddenly returned: stay or leave everything behind once again. Historical research shows that the overwhelming majority of the Russian community chose to leave. Their destinations stretched across the globe. The United States, Australia, South America, and other countries welcomed thousands of former residents of Shanghai. For many families, it was the second or even the third forced migration within a single generation. Imagine what that meant. A child born in Imperial Russia fled to China as a teenager, built an adult life in Shanghai, raised children there, and then, in middle age, packed another suitcase to begin again in a country they had never seen before. Few people in history have had to build an entirely new life more than once. These families did it repeatedly. There's a quiet tragedy hidden inside that journey. Every migration required sacrifices. The first time they left behind houses. The second time they left behind businesses. The third time they left behind friends buried in foreign cemeteries. With each departure, the amount of physical property grew smaller. But the weight of memory became heavier. For the children and grandchildren, identity became increasingly complex. Were they Russian, Chinese, American, Australian? Many had never seen Russia. Some no longer spoke fluent Russian. Others continued attending Orthodox churches established by émigré communities, preserving traditions their grandparents had carried across continents. Home had become something impossible to locate on a map. It existed inside family stories, inside old photographs, inside recipes prepared on holidays, inside songs that grandparents insisted on teaching to children who spoke another language more comfortably than Russian. That is one of exile's greatest paradoxes. The farther people travel from their homeland, the more fiercely they often protect its memory. The Russian colony of Shanghai eventually disappeared. Its schools closed, its organizations dissolved or relocated. Its neighborhoods changed beyond recognition. The city moved forward. History moved forward, but fragments remained. Old Orthodox churches, scattered family archives, photographs faded by time, names engraved on cemetery stones. Most importantly, descendants carried the story forward, even when they no longer carried Russian passports. For historians, Shanghai became one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the Russian diaspora. Not because it was the wealthiest community, not because it held political power, but because it demonstrated something extraordinary. An entire society had managed to recreate pieces of a lost civilization thousands of kilometers from home. It lasted for decades. Then it vanished almost as quietly as it had appeared. Today, if you walk through modern Shanghai, you will struggle to imagine that this city once echoed with Russian conversations, Orthodox hymns, and memories of an empire that no longer existed. Glass skyscrapers stand where refugee families once searched for work. Luxury hotels overlook streets where former Imperial officers drove taxis to feed their children. Time has transformed the city, but beneath its modern skyline lies an almost forgotten chapter of human endurance. And that forgotten chapter asks one final question. If a nation can survive only in the memories of its people, what happens when the last generation that remembers is finally gone? Walk through Shanghai today, and almost nothing immediately tells you that this city was once home to the largest Russian émigré community in the Far East. The cafes have changed. The streets have changed. The skyline has changed. Glass towers now rise where refugee families once searched for work, where former Imperial officers stood in line hoping for a day's wages, and where children learned Russian history in classrooms thousands of kilometers from the country their parents still called home. Time did what wars could not. It quietly erased the visible traces. And yet, the story did not disappear. It simply moved. When the Russian community left Shanghai after the communist victory in China, its people scattered across the world. Historical research shows that thousands settled in the United States, Australia, South America, and other countries, carrying little more than family photographs, Orthodox icons, worn suitcases, and memories that no government could confiscate. Their descendants live there today. Some still attend Russian Orthodox churches founded by émigré communities. Some preserve family archives filled with faded photographs from Shanghai. Some no longer speak Russian fluently. Others know only fragments of a language their grandparents once refused to abandon. But almost all inherited the same story. Not the story of victory, the story of survival. That may be the greatest legacy of the Russians of Shanghai. They prove that identity is not protected by borders. It is protected by people. Governments can collapse. Empires can disappear. Passports can become worthless pieces of paper. Cities can forget who once walked their streets. But memory survives in places no army can conquer. In a grandmother teaching an old prayer, in a family recipe prepared every holiday, in a photograph carefully passed from one generation to the next, in a surname that still carries the echo of another homeland. There is a profound irony at the heart of this story. The refugees who believed they would return to Russia rarely did. Instead, it was Russia that continued to travel with them, across oceans, across continents, across generations. The empire they lost survived, not on political maps, but inside ordinary families. Perhaps that is the true meaning of exile. It is not only the loss of a place, it is the lifelong effort to prevent the loss of yourself. The Russians of Shanghai did not preserve palaces. They did not preserve governments. They preserved something far more fragile: memory. And memory, unlike stone, can survive even after an empire has fallen. Thank you for watching. If stories like this help you see history not as a collection of dates, but as the lives of real people forced to make impossible choices, consider subscribing. Every documentary on this channel is built from carefully researched historical sources to preserve stories that deserve to be remembered, not because they change the world, but because they reveal what ordinary people become when history changes their world. Before you go, consider this question. If you had only one suitcase and one chance to leave your homeland forever, what would you take? And what part of yourself would you fight hardest to keep alive?